In this lesson, we're going to talk about styling, how to write CSS in your Next.js components in Next.js 13 and specifically the app router. Now, this is not a CSS course, but I thought I'll give you an overview of different options that you have when it comes to CSS and styling in Next.js. Now I know we have set up our project with Tailwind CSS in the previous video, and that's what we're going to be using throughout the course. But if you don't like to use Tailwind CSS for whatever reason, or if you just want to know what other options you have when it comes to supporting Next.js, I thought to give you these options here. Now, if you head to the documentation for the styling, you can see what Next.js supports out of the box. The first and the most simple way to write CSS in your Next.js app is the global CSS. We touched on this in the previous lesson, but once again, inside of our app directory, we had this global.css, which is your global CSS file. Now, you can write any CSS over here, just like your traditional CSS, and use it inside your component. So for example, if I go to my page component, and let's say I remove this classes that I added using Tailwind, and I save, going back to my live site, I can see now I've removed the Tailwind classes. Let's now go to our global CSS and say if you're targeting the H1 tags, and let's target the font size over here to be, I don't know, 3 rem. And you can see that affected over there. Or to add font weight, let's say we want to make it bold. Now, this is the simplest way to write CSS. You have your traditional CSS selectors and you just write everything inside this global CSS. You can import this global CSS in any layout, page, or component inside of the app router. You don't have to do it inside this root layout. This is where we did it so that it affects all of our routes or components, but you can import it anywhere inside of the app directory. Now, the downside to using traditional CSS or one global file is naming conventions or class name collisions as your application grows. It can also lead to larger CSS bundles, and it will be harder to kind of maintain as your application grow. All the styles and all the classes are going to be in one file, which makes it less maintainable. Now, the second option is CSS modules. Again, this is supported out of the box. And to use CSS modules, you would go with this convention. So you can create, let's say, page.module.css. And you can write your CSS classes over here. And the way that it works is, let's say I have a class of title over here. And in this title, I'm going to say font size is this 3 rem. And then let's say the font weight is also bold. And let's just change the color here so it's a bit different. So let's say our color is green. Okay, so I'm going to define this title over here. Now, inside of my page where I am trying to use this style, what I'm going to have to do is to import this as styles. So I'm going to import styles from, and I'm going to target this page.module.css. And then here for the class name, I'm going to pass an object that says styles and then .title. Okay, this title is the same class that I just defined here, and we're going to import all of the classes that we have written in this CSS module as one object. We call it styles. You can call it classes or whatever you want. I call it styles, or the convention is to call it styles. And then I'm accessing the title class in my styles object. If I go back to my application, I'll see that I still have this applied to my title tag. Now, the good thing about CSS modules is that this CSS module is actually scoped to this component. So CSS module is really good if you want to write component level CSS. It makes it way more maintainable, because if you want to access the CSS belonging to this page component or any other component, you can just go to the CSS module belonging to that component and then kind of make your changes and updates there. And the other good thing is that the class names are locally scoped. So if you have another title class in another component or page, they're not going to collide with each other because they're scoped locally. If you actually go and inspect the source code over here. Let me just make this to calm down. Let me just make this a bit bigger. So if you can see, my h1 tag has this page title, and then it's generated a unique class name, and that's how they're not going to collide. It picks up the component name, and it picks up the class name, and then some random characters at the end, so your class names are not going to collide. Now, if you had a different route, just as an example here, for example, I have an about route, and inside of it, let's say I have a page.jsx to represent this page component. Let's say this is my about page. We're going to talk about different routes and routing in general in future lessons, but just as an example, if I had a different component and I also wanted to have a module here, I can co-locate that here by creating another page.module.css and then write my classes over here, and the class title that I write over here, whatever I put in here, doesn't collide with the class title that I had in the other module. So that's the second option that you have. It is, let me just save this and delete this about page. So as you can see, this is one level more advanced than writing global CSS. It's at least scoped to your component. It's maintainable because for every component, you could just dive into the CSS module that belongs to that component, access the classes and update it there. But again, it's a matter of preference. I prefer to use Tailwind. Some people prefer to use CSS modules. Now, next is obviously Tailwind CSS. This is what we're going to be using throughout this course. It's also the recommended CSS framework from the Next.js team, as you saw in the script in the previous lesson. Now, Tailwind is a utility-first CSS framework, meaning that you write utility classes that actually is targeting CSS values. So instead of writing CSS with the traditional way of your selectors and a separate file and your CSS values and declarations, you're just writing CSS right inside of your JSX, inside of your component, so you can co-locate the CSS and the styling here, which makes it very fast to just find your component, change the styling, updating it, prototyping it, and then, but basically underneath, you're just writing utility classes. It's not a class that affects a whole bunch a lot. It's just a class or a utility that targets a specific CSS value. Now, what makes Tailwind CSS even better, in my opinion, as a developer, is the ecosystem of the frameworks that are built and work with Tailwind CSS. For example, this Tailwind UI, which is a component library from the Tailwind team, gives you some already made components. So for your page sections, for the application UIs, different types of elements, different types of sections in your site. So these are pretty cool components that you can just copy paste to your code or get inspired by. Now, this is a paid library, but there are also some free libraries. For example, this Headless UI, which is also from the Tailwind team, is an awesome library for some components that you can see here: menu, drop down, combo box, the stuff that you would usually use in any application. For example, this menu drop down is a drop down menu that works with Tailwind CSS. They also have this transition and animations built into this Headless UI, so you can use it with that. Now, it doesn't come styled, so it's unstyled. That's why they call it headless. You can style it however you want. It's just the APIs that it gives you this functionality. Now, another fantastic library is Radix UI. I really like this. They have added Tailwind support, so you can go, let me just make this a bit bigger. You can go to their site and to their documentation. You can see the list of components that they have. For example, if you're talking about this navigation menu, you can see you get navigation and some animations right out of the box. Now you can use it with CSS, as I mentioned, or Stitches. This is, I believe, a CSS and JS library, and the Tailwind CSS, which basically uses Tailwind classes to create what you can see out there. Now, this ecosystem of different components or frameworks that allow you to build these type of components without having to create everything from the scratch is also what I think makes Tailwind awesome. Now, the other option, going back to the list here, is CSS and JS. To be honest with you, this doesn't quite align with the way that Next.js 13 and React is headed with the React Server components, because CSS in JS is basically embedding CSS inside of your JavaScript, inside of your JS components. Now, with Next.js 13 and the app router and React Server components, oftentimes for a server component, you don't ship any JavaScript to the client side, so there is no JS runtime for you to run your CSS. Now, most of the libraries, most of the CSS and JS libraries don't work with React Server components as of now. You can still use them in client-side components because they do have that JavaScript runtime. But generally speaking, they don't work in the app router. If you're using Next.js in the pages directory, you can still continue to use them. But inside the app router in Next.js 13, for now, CSS and JS is not a viable option. Now, this was an overview of different options you have when it comes to styling your components. Now, before we wrap up, I just wanted to mention something. If you're using or wanting to import any external style sheet, the way that you would do it is import them directly from their npm package. So for example, if you wanted to, God forbid, you use Bootstrap in Next.js, you can just import it directly right over here. You cannot use a link tag to download it here. You can either install this package as a dependency and co-locate it with your code. That's one option, or import it directly here in any page layout or component inside of your app folder. So this was a styling in a nutshell. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about deploying our app to production. Using Vercel, we're going to make our application live on the World Wide Web so we can access it from anywhere, not just from our local machine. See you there. Bye-bye.